It sounds incredibly paradoxical to say that nuance is dying in storytelling, particularly like in the Western media space, especially during an era where morally grey characters are peaking in popularity. But the reality here is simple. Writing morally grey characters does not directly imply that there will be nuance in story. Nuance in storytelling and story in fiction is more than just writing morally grey characters. And that is not to even mention the fact that if you actually look at a lot of these morally grey characters, a lot of them aren't morally grey at all. They just operate in this grey space, grey area of justice, not morality. That is why a lot of people, a majority of the audience, loves them unconditionally and would defend them like anything. Because if a script were to actually give you like a genuine morally grey character, you would either despise them or you would love them with a deep psychological guilt for doing so. Instead, these morally grey characters are engineered with rock solid traditional internal morals. They simply utilize a very unconventional vigilante interpretation of justice, a trait that the real world audience finds it incredibly easy to romanticize. This realization exposes the core of the problem. We haven't actually evolved past this ancient binary of storytelling, the good versus the evil. We are still, albeit under like a very different manner, a modern veneer, telling the exact same reductive stories of absolute good and absolute evil that have existed for centuries. Now, there isn't anything inherently wrong with these kind of stories, because if they are written with care, then they could also have nuance. But the problem is when a story claims to be having nuance, being different from the traditionally good versus evil story, only to actually be exactly that. So why has the industry stopped writing true nuance? Like, why are we afraid of writing true nuance? That is exactly what we are going to answer in the video today, including why nuance is important and what are these instances where you can actually see nuance being just thrown out of the window. So without any further ado, let's head to the courtyard for the discussion today. The fundamental importance of nuance in storytelling is that it grounds, it anchors fiction into the complexity of human reality. Um, if a story completely lacks nuance, it starts to feel illogical, artificial, and almost childish. Now, handing a child a very simple story, a story that utilizes the simple binary framework, is understandable and completely acceptable because they are developing minds. They need a stark, baseline structure to comprehend foundational concepts. It's like handing a child a book on calculus when they're supposed to be reading about addition. Like, that's not how it works. You will start them by giving them, the basic foundation of numbers before you start teaching them calculus. However, the crisis occurs when the industry lazily copy pastes this infantile formula meant for children onto fiction and stories that is meant for adults and teenagers. Like, you wouldn't start giving adults and teenagers book on basic addition. They have gone past it. They need to understand the complexity of numbers. Just in a very similar way, they need to understand the complexity of story and of world and reality. Let me make a critical airtight distinction here, okay? Introducing nuance does not mean that you're trying to justify a character's crimes or actions. Let's say if a narrative explores this architecture of a serial killer, psychological architecture of a serial killer, the character is a serial killer and you're following them, a well-crafted backstory does not exist to suddenly absolve them off their violence or sort of demand forgiveness from the audience. Its purpose is to lay out the precise causal mechanisms, the structural why. Why is this person committing heinous crimes? Why is this person here? So we can comprehend the trajectory of their devolution. But most modern spaces, most commentary spaces, fiction spaces, think of as nuance. It's just this really lazy narrative attempt to construct an excuse for bad behavior. True nuance never asks you to sort of validate a horrific action. It simply demands that you understand the sequence of events that led to it. The single greatest culprit of this complete lack of nuance has to be this dystopian young adult novel space, because almost every text in this genre is created from the same blueprint, the rebellious, rule-breaking younger generation pitted against this core, rule-binding, systemically oppressive older generation. I mean, it could have worked at one point when maybe it was the genre was at its peak and it was rise. It was just starting out, but now every story just leans into this formula instead of discovering or creating something new out of it. This absolute black and white binary dichotomy is just easy, low effort engine to create conflict without putting too much effort. We're rarely, if ever, permitted to look at the perspective, the structural perspective of this said oppressive regime. The script just simply demands that we see them as these villains who are cartoonishly evil, and that's where the world building stops. Where is the political and human nuance? Where is the reality of the situation? Because if we look at real world institutions and governments, that is not how they operate. They do not operate as these perfectly unified, cackling villain networks like some sort of villain organization. They are complex, messy structures defined by internal friction. A realistic dystopian regime would be one that is struggling violently behind doors because one political faction thinks that a brutal method is the only way to save humans from extinction, while another political faction thinks, an opposing faction thinks that no, there needs to be like a human approach to this. This is how systemic sort of entities actually function. Just because we in the current day and age, most of us are just profoundly exhausted by much of the government's policies, does not mean every single individual part of the state's structure is like a structural demon. Nuance means exposing that internal ideological warfare between factions and people within the government. Instead, modern fiction just gives us nothing but absolute binaries. And on the rare occasion, if our heroes just so happen to be wearing the uniform of the regime, of the oppressive regime, then they are never written as someone who genuinely believes that the state's tactics are like best or the only way to save world. No, they're always this sort of flawless, morally right double agent who's secretly working to like dismantle the system from the inside. Imagine how much higher the narrative stakes would be if the plot gave us two main characters who both want to save the world but both have their own different beliefs as to how that can be achieved. One genuinely believes that the government's extreme measures are the only way out, while the other violently disagrees, and both could be right and wrong in their own way. The psychological tension would stem from this profound exploration of this tragic conflict of principles, not a cartoonish battle of good and evil, but instead of this complexity, the script just settles for this flat, unearned moral superiority that is given to one group. And that is exactly why modern nuance is dead. However, if a writer's primary goal is to, let's say, appease the consumer and satisfy market expectations, aren't they will be practically like required to draw a sharp line between the character the audience is supposed to love and one they are supposed to hate. In a world where everything needs to be sort of spoon fed to you, like you can't think on your own, you must be told what you're supposed to learn from something. The market just demands that an author writes their book in a way that the audience automatically knows who's the bad character and who's the good character, because in this hyper commercialized framework, nuance would simply ruin the profit margin. Look no further than the mechanical execution of contemporary love triangle. A lot of people hate it, and while there is inherently anything wrong with love triangle, the trope itself, the problem is the way it's actually executed, and I've actually discussed it over at my Substack. What is this ultimate lazy way modern writers resolve a romantic script? They don't have the protagonist make a very complex, emotionally agonizing choice based on evolving human compatibility. They don't look at, they don't have their character look at two people and say, "Oh, you both are nice, you both are good, but I just love this one more. I just find this one more compatible, but I think both of you are a nice person." No, this is not how it's going to happen. What is going to happen is that the author is simply going to force the main character to choose between a flawless good guy and the obvious bad guy. And how do they engineer this very clean binary? By throwing nuance out of the window. Let me make it entirely clear. It is not nuance when a writer suddenly strips a character's established personality away on the 11th hour, like turning a viable alternative partner into this sudden unhinged threat to the protagonist just to make the choice easy. Like, it is not once when a protagonist has to choose between two love interests and both of them are good at till a point, but when it comes to the choice, the writer suddenly turns one of the good characters into this really pathetic person so that the protagonist can easily choose the better. That's not nuance, that's bad writing. That is just structural character assassination, actually, and it's the absolute worst way to resolve love triangles. If you, as I said, if you want to take a deeper look onto how to write good love triangles, I have dissected that over at my Substack. You can check that out. Link is in the description. This complete lack of nuance in contemporary romance leads directly back to actually the exact architectural crisis I dissected in my video essay called "Fictional Men Are Products." The romantic leads are no longer designed to be sort of messy, multi-dimensional human beings. They're calibrated to be consumer products, flawless, hyper-tailored vessels whose sole function is to unconditionally validate the main character. The digital consumer space demands the absolute black and white dichotomy because it grants them a safe psychological harbor, a character to love without a shred of guilt, and a villain to actively despise without the burden of self-judgment. Now, this behavior actually directly mirrors the deeply problematic trend on contemporary social media, the rise of instant public trial, where an accused individual is thoroughly convicted by the court of public opinion long before the legal system can actually even investigate the facts and put them on trial. Now, I can completely understand where all of this is coming from, the sociological origin of this impulse. In spaces where structural justice systems genuinely fail to protect the vulnerable people, communities then are kind of forced to step in and demand accountability on their own terms. They're forced to do the investigation on their own in a way without any legal help. And when a collective comes together to protect the marginalized, that impulse is born from a desire for human betterment, and I can understand where it's coming from. However, the crisis sort of gets worse. It begins to sort of rise when, we copy paste this hyper vigilante mindset onto literally every single human infraction. We take it and we start judging every single case that we come across. The moment we start to do exactly that, we start rendering absolute verdicts without a shred of concrete proof. Like, we start coming to judgments just because that's what fits the narrative the best. We start to overanalyze every variable through the lens of confirmation bias. Like, everything that we see, every detail that we see in a particular case, we start to see that as a proof of a person's crime or a person's innocence. It desperately, it warps our reality to fit the narrative we want to see, rather than the reality that actually exists. There is a brilliant Chinese drama that I watched recently called Zhao Adventures, and I think it perfectly encapsulates this dangerous fiction of vigilante justice and explains precisely why the rule of law actually should exist and exists. Uh, just a heads up, there might be a bit of spoilers ahead, so if you want to, you can just skip on to the next section. In the narrative, our protagonist, Zhao, also called as the Southern Knight or like Imperial Cat, before he joins the Kaifeng prefecture, before he, comes under the working of law, comes under the working of the emperor, used to actually originally operate outside law under the vigilante identity of Yaksha, executing criminals based on his own personal moral code, and everything he thought was going all right until the system shatters when an imitator takes up the exact identity of Yaksha, but operates with this completely different definition of culpability. In a tragic case involving a brothel, this new Yaksha vigilante decides that the innocent family of the one of the victims is equally complicit in the systemic crime of women getting sold to brothels, declaring that the family must be punished too. Zhao violently disagrees, and with this idea of this expanded definition of justice, of guilt, the resulting clash eventually culminates in a disastrous fatal fire, leaving a young son as the sole traumatized survivor of the vigilante's unchecked judgment, and our protagonist has to live with that guilt for the rest of his life. With what this narrative actually masterfully highlights is that human beings possess entirely subject to fluid definitions of good and evil. What might be good to me might be evil to you, and what might be evil to me might be okay to you. We all harbor implicit biases, and left to our own devices, our personal metrics for punishment will inevitably lead to like devastating collateral damage. That is why objective legal frameworks exist. They are built to strip away emotional hysteria and enforce a baseline of objective measurement. When storytellers banish nuance from fiction, the consequences inevitably bleed into a real world society. A society that is raised on flat narratives will eventually demand exactly that, a flat binary reality, frantically hunting for this absolute hero to worship and an absolute villain to destroy. This is why preserving nuance in our stories is vital cultural necessity. True nuance trains human minds to pause, to analyze, and to think critically, completely disrupting the dangerous instinct to rush to an absolute conclusion the moment a loud narrative demands it. That is precisely why I think subtle messaging is the lifeblood of mature storytelling. A, a master writer never steps onto the page to tell the audience what is right and what is wrong. That ultimate moral verdict should be left for the reader's internal analysis. By forcing the consumer to engage with structural ambiguity, by not telling them explicitly who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, a story actively trains them to think critically, independently, and analytically. Cognitive skills that I feel are tragically scarce in today's hyper-reactive world. As a writer and analyst, I have always believed in the necessity of exploring both sides of a story, both sides of a narrative equation. I do not pursue the perspective of the antagonist or of a criminal because, like, I'm searching for some sort of cheap justification for their crimes. I pursue it because I demand to know the exact psychological trajectory that led them to being who they are. Understanding a character's personal history, their cognitive wiring, their emotional fractures, it's vital. It exposes the profound impact that generational family dynamics, socio-economic pressures, or toxic societal belief systems have on human psyche. That is true narrative nuance. Nuance is never about, as I said, about lazily throwing a tragic backstory onto a script to excuse a villain's atrocities. It's about laying bare a complex history that reveals how the pressures of our world can systemically rewire a human mind. And with that, final thought, we close the doors to the courtyard today. If this deep dive made you look at modern character design, nuance in storytelling, and public discourse a little differently, please take a moment to explore the rest of the courtyard, i.e. my channel. Check out the rest of the videos there. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of courtyard theorists. And as a parting recommendation, if I may, if a complex, structurally sound historical drama with amazing fight scenes and really good story and mystery is something that you like, is something that you actively crave for, then please do check out the drama Zhao Adventures. I think it is one of the best dramas I have seen so far, and it is a brilliant piece of narrative engineering. Just a heads up though, if romance is something that you seek in stories, be mindful of the fact that Zhao Adventures is not a romantic story. It leans more into that very mystery, detective kind of style of storytelling, and focuses on themes of friendship and all of that, themes of friendship, justice, and that. And I will leave you with that. Thank you for thinking with me today in the courtyard. I'll see you the next time. Until then, keep theorizing.